The morning of February 10, 1942, dawned with a sharp chill in the air, but 7-year-old Emily Carter was too excited to notice. She sat by the windowsill of their modest apartment in the Brooklyn Navy Yard district, cradling her beloved porcelain doll Nellie, whose blue ribbon matched the one tied around Emily's own ponytail. The war had changed everything. Her father, Harold Carter, a mechanic at the shipyard, was now working longer shifts, often returning with grease on his hands and a faraway look in his eyes. Her mother, Mary, had started volunteering with the local Red Cross, folding bandages and writing letters for soldiers who couldn't write themselves. But Emily was too young to grasp the full weight of the war. To her, the apartment was still a place of laughter and stories until, that morning, at 9:17 a.m., the ground shook. It started as a deep, distant rumble. Then sirens screamed through the harbor district. Neighbors poured out into the hallway, shouting. Some said it was a drill. Others whispered of German U-boats. But the truth was worse. A munitions barge docked nearby had erupted in a violent explosion accident, perhaps, or sabotaged. The blast ripped through the port warehouses and sent a shockwave that shattered windows, caved in walls, and crumbled the east side of the apartment complex. Emily had been playing by the window when it happened, and in an instant, she was gone. When the smoke cleared, all that remained of apartment 3B was a pile of bricks and dust. Search and rescue workers dug for days, pulling out survivors and bodies. Harold spent every moment he wasn't at the shipyard, helping with the search, his face streaked with soot and tears. Mary never left the site. She stood among the wreckage, holding Emily's shoe in one hand and Nellie's tiny bonnet in the other, praying for a miracle. But the days turned into weeks, and no sign of Emily or her doll was ever found. The authorities declared her presumed dead. A ceremony was held at the nearby naval chapel, with folded flags and whispered condolences. But to the Carters, there was no closure, only silence. Harold stopped sleeping in their bedroom. He moved to the sofa and began leaving the hallway light on at night, just in case. Mary stopped going to the Red Cross. She began writing daily letters addressed to Emily, pouring her sorrow and hope onto pages she never mailed. Neighbors eventually moved on. New tenants came and went. The city patched the buildings, painted over the burns, and buried the past under concrete and memory. But Harold and Mary never left. The war ended in 1945, and victory banners fluttered over Times Square. But at the corner of Dock Avenue and Lansing Street, a quiet grief hung like fog. Emily Carter had vanished without a trace, like a ghost swallowed by the war itself. And Nellie, the doll, was gone too until 4 decades later, when time would loosen its grip and the rubble would begin to speak. London, March 1942. The morning of March 3rd began like any other in wartime London. Grey skies, damp streets, and the distant rumble of anti-aircraft drills. 8-year-old Lillian Westley, with her copper curls tucked beneath a knitted hat, sat near the window of her family's cramped flat in Brixton. Her doll, named Molly, sat beside her in a tiny wicker chair, dressed in a patchwork dress Lillian's mother had made from scraps. "Do you think Daddy will write today?" she asked her mother, who was stirring a thin porridge on the stove. "He might, love," Eleanor replied softly, her eyes betraying a worry she didn't speak. "He's stationed near Dover now, but letters take time." Lillian nodded solemnly, then turned her gaze out the window. The streets were quieter than usual. Even the children who used to kick around old tin cans for fun were nowhere in sight. There had been warnings of a potential bombing that week. Most people were already planning to spend the night in underground shelters. That afternoon, Eleanor took Lillian by the hand and walked to the grocer's a few blocks down. They passed sandbagged buildings and boarded windows. People walked quickly, heads down, avoiding unnecessary conversation. The air held tension like something awful was waiting just out of sight. As they stood in line for rationed butter, the sirens screamed through the streets, high and wailing. Eleanor's heart lurched. She tightened her grip on Lillian's hand. "We need to run," she whispered. The two began to sprint down the road, but a crowd was already clogging the alleyway leading to the nearest underground station. Eleanor's eyes darted around. "The baker's cellar this way," she shouted, pulling Lillian along. But the moment they crossed the street, the sky cracked open. A German aircraft broke through the clouds, and the bombs began to fall. The first impact was deafening. Dust and glass exploded into the air. The force knocked Eleanor and Lillian apart. As debris rained down, Eleanor screamed her daughter's name, but her voice was drowned in the chaos. The bakery's roof collapsed, and smoke quickly filled the air. When Eleanor came to, she was in a stretcher outside. Her head was bleeding, her hand bruised but alive. "My daughter, my Lillian," she cried, but no one answered. Paramedics rushed past her. The bakery had been obliterated. No survivors were found within the rubble. For days, Eleanor refused to believe it. She searched every shelter, every hospital, but there was no trace of her little girl. Not even Molly, the doll, had been found. She was told gently by the authorities that Lillian had likely perished instantly, and with so many losses that week, there would be no individual grave, just her name carved among the missing. But Eleanor didn't mourn, not properly, not fully. She left London 2 months later, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the memory of Lillian's laughter. England, 1942 to 1982. Eleanor Westley moved north, settling in a quiet village on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales, where the war felt distant and life moved slower. She rented a small cottage with ivy-covered walls, started work as a seamstress, and rarely spoke about the daughter she'd lost to the villagers. Eleanor was kind but private. She never married again. Her neighbors knew she'd lived through the Blitz and carried a sadness that never fully left her eyes. Children who came to her for mended trousers or patched coats sometimes asked about the photo on her shelf, a small, faded portrait of a red-haired girl holding a ragged doll. Her name was Lillian, Eleanor would say, then grow quiet. Years passed. The war ended. Soldiers returned, cities rebuilt, and London moved forward. But Eleanor never returned. She avoided train stations, never read the news on anniversaries of the bombings, and kept every letter her husband had sent before he died in combat, eyed in a bundle with blue ribbon dot. By the 1960s, her hair had turned white. She walked with a cane. The cottage, once lonely, became a place of comfort for local children who visited for sweets and stories about sewing buttons the size of saucers. But no one ever dared ask about Lillian again. She had grown used to silence, until, in the summer of 1982, a letter arrived. It was from a historical preservation committee in London. The city council had begun reconstruction efforts in the Brixton neighborhood, where several buildings destroyed in the war remained untouched. One of them was the bakery where Eleanor and Lillian had last been seen. The letter mentioned they had found some remnant small personal items and were trying to contact surviving relatives to verify any historical artifacts. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read it. She hadn't been to Brixton in 40 years. She wasn't sure she could bear it, but something inside her stirred, the kind of ache that doesn't fade, no matter how many seasons pass. A week later, she was on a train south. The neighborhood had changed completely. New buildings, new people, new language on the signs, but the old bakery lot was still there, fenced off, with workers digging gently through layers of soil and debris. A young man in a hard hat greeted her. "Mrs. Westley, we were hoping you'd come. We found something." From a box, he pulled out a doll. It was faded, one eye missing, the dress tattered and scorched, but Eleanor's legs gave out beneath her. It was Molly, the doll Lillian had never gone anywhere without, the doll Eleanor had sewn herself. Back in 1937, tears spilled freely. For the first time in 4 decades, Eleanor sobbed. She clutched Molly to her chest, whispering her daughter's name over and over. The young man knelt beside her, speechless. For everyone present, the air felt sacred, like history had paused for a moment to allow a wound to bleed properly. Later that evening, Eleanor sat alone in her hotel room, staring at the doll on the table. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her daughter had left behind more than silence. London, 1982. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The hotel room, though modest and warm, felt suffocating. She sat by the window with the doll Molly cradled in her lap, like a fragile relic. The streetlights painted long shadows across the room, and the distant hum of cars and chatter outside felt a world away from the echo of bombs. She still carried in her memory. She held the doll up to the light again. The stitches were hers, the buttons, mismatched eyes from an old sewing tin, one brown and one blue. She remembered Lillian laughing as she had named the doll Molly the Brave after a story Eleanor used to tell her about, a sailor girl who crossed oceans to rescue her mother. The emotions surged again, but now something had changed. Molly hadn't been buried under the bakery by accident. Her condition, her placement, it all suggested care. Someone had tried to preserve her, protect her. even while chaos rained from the sky. Could it mean Lillian had survived longer than she thought? The next morning, Eleanor returned to the excavation site. A middle-aged historian named Simon met her. "We've uncovered more of the basement," he explained, walking carefully over wooden planks laid across the rubble. "There's a chance we can piece together what happened that day, Mrs. Wesley." In the shadows of the exposed foundation, Eleanor saw outlines of rooms she remembered. The pantry where Lillian used to sneak cookies, the support beam near the oven, a crack in the wall where they once hung paper drawings, and then Simon pointed this corner. "That's where we found the doll, beneath a wooden shelf, covered in blankets and what looks like a child's coat." Eleanor felt her knees weaken again. That was Lillian's hiding spot. During the air raids, they had practiced it over and over. If the sirens ever sounded and Eleanor wasn't there, Lillian was to run to that corner and wait under the shelf. It was a desperate plan made by desperate mothers during desperate times. But now, Eleanor realized something chilling. Lillian had followed the plan and had waited, possibly until the very end. Simon placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We'll do carbon testing on the textiles, but there's more this morning." We uncovered a small metal box nearby, a keepsake tin. He opened it carefully, revealing its contents: a lock of auburn hair tied with a pink ribbon, and a folded piece of paper. Eleanor's breath caught. Her hands shook as she took the note. It was childlike, written in big, uneven letters. "Mama, I am here. I'm waiting like you said. I hope the bad noise stops soon. I have Molly with me. I'm being brave like the sailor girl." Tears fell, unrestrained. It wasn't just a discovery. It was a message, a whisper across time from her little girl, left in the hope that one day it would reach her. Eleanor stood there for a long time, eyes closed, the paper pressed to her heart. Lillian had done everything right. She had been brave. She had held on. And in a way, she had waited not just for rescue, but to be remembered. And now she was. The letter never left Eleanor's side. She carried it tucked inside her coat pocket, like a sacred relic, unfolding and reading it again and again as if her daughter's handwriting could bring her back. She no longer felt the numbness that had gripped her for decades. In its place was a trembling kind of clarity and need to understand everything that had happened, down to the final seconds in that ruined bakery. She sat down with Simon and the excavation team later that afternoon in the small historical society building a few blocks from the site. They had laid out photographs, documents, maps, and sketches from the 1942 bombing raid. The scope of the destruction had been enormous, but new details were emerging, some from city archives, others from witnesses long silent. "This section here," Simon said, tapping a floor plan, "was partially shielded. That might explain how the box, doll, and note remained relatively untouched." Eleanor leaned in. "But why didn't anyone find her then? Or her remains?" "We believe the building collapsed in such a way that this portion was sealed off entirely. Crews focused on recovering survivors from the more accessible areas. The fire from the explosion above melted much of the structure. It created a kind of tomb, tragic but strangely preserving." It was hard to hear, but it also meant that Lillian had likely passed away quietly, still clutching Molly, waiting in darkness, her mother only blocks away and unaware. Simon hesitated, then said softly, "There's something else." He produced a faded photograph, black and white, with edges curled and cracked. It showed a line of children standing beside an emergency evacuation bus from 1942. One of the girls looked remarkably like Lillian. Same curls, same stubborn expression Eleanor remembered from every bedtime refusal. This was taken 3 days before the bombing. According to school records, a few children from that neighborhood were sent to Kent as part of a last-minute relocation. There's a chance Lillian was meant to be with them. Eleanor's breath caught, but she wasn't. "No," Simon said. "We spoke with a retired bus driver who worked that route. He recalled a woman running down the street, child in hand, trying to catch the last bus. But a raid began, and chaos broke out." Eleanor pressed her palms to her face. She remembered that day. She had come home late from the hospital shift. The neighbors said they hadn't seen Lillian, and she had assumed, the worst, assumed her daughter had been caught in the blast while trying to find her. But maybe Lillian had tried to reach her. And when she couldn't, she had returned to the only place that felt safe, under the shelf, in the corner, with Molly. Eleanor sat quietly with the thought. Her daughter hadn't been abandoned. She hadn't been forgotten. She had followed her mother's instructions. She had waited. She had written a message. Now, 40 years later, that message had found its way home. It felt like a second chance, not at motherhood, not at undoing the pain, but at witnessing her daughter's bravery, her voice, one last time. That night, Eleanor wrote in her own journal for the first time in decades. "I lost her in the fire," she wrote, "but today, I found her in the ashes." The story of Lillian McCrae and her unearthed doll swept through the local community like a spring storm, sudden, unstoppable, and deeply stirring. It began with a small article in the Camden Gazette, written by a young journalist who had followed the excavation from the beginning. The headline read, "Doll unearthed from 1942 rubble, carries message from lost child," accompanied by a grainy image of the doll mollycradled in Eleanor's trembling hands. The story captured the imagination of an entire nation. Soon, larger papers picked it up. Eleanor received letters from strangers, veterans, mothers, historians. Some remembered the bombings. Others had lost children, siblings, or entire families. The story wasn't just about one little girl anymore. It was about memory, grief, and the fragile threads that tied past to present. Eleanor, now in her 80s, found herself invited to speak at a remembrance event at the Imperial War Museum in London. She was hesitant at first. Public speaking had never been her strength, and her grief was still raw. But something about the museum halls, filled with silent artifacts of war and survival, made her feel that Lillian would want to be remembered, not hidden, not buried under decades of silence. When Eleanor took the podium, she carried Molly in her lap. "I'm not here," she began, "because I am brave. I am here because my daughter was." The audience held its breath. "She wrote me a letter," Eleanor continued, voice trembling. "She was alone, scared, but she still found a way to comfort me. She wanted me to know she was okay." Imagine that, a little girl comforting her mother in the darkest moment of her life. Tears flowed freely among the listeners. She finished by reading the note aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dear Mummy, I'm waiting like you said. Molly's with me. I'm not scared. I love you always." Lillian. No one in the auditorium moved for several seconds after. Later that night, Eleanor was approached by a quiet man in his 60s, clutching a photograph. His mother had once lived on the same block as the McCraes. In the photo was a group of children sitting on a stoop, laughing, arms linked, and there grinning wide. With a missing front tooth was Lillian. Eleanor's fingers touched the photo like she was smoothing the fabric of memory itself. She was the bravest of them all, she said. In the weeks that followed, a small exhibit was created at the local museum. It displayed Molly, Lillian's note, and a timeline of the bombing that claimed the child's life. School children came on field trips. Veterans left flowers. Mothers whispered Lillian's name at the glass, holding their own children closer. And Eleanor, she came every Friday, sat quietly in front of the case, and whispered stories to the doll, stories Lillian never got to live, of birthday cakes, first dances, weddings, children. All the things that might have been, but thanks to one message, scrawled in a trembling child's hand, and the miracle of time and memory, Lillian McCrae would never be forgotten. By the time the leaves began to fall that year, the town of Camden had changed. Where there had once been a crumbling corner lot overgrown and long forgotten, a new garden was blooming. Volunteers came from all around the county to help. Retired veterans laid bricks. Local children painted ceramic butterflies. A stonemason from Kent offered to carve a plaque at no cost. And at the center of it all stood Eleanor McCrae, frail but determined, overseeing each step with quiet purpose. This wasn't just a park, it was a promise. A promise that no child lost to war would fade into dust and silence again. The small garden became known as Lillian's Rest, and at its heart, under the shade of a young cherry tree, was a bronze bench sculpted in the shape of a little girl holding a doll. The doll was Molly, every detail perfectly replicated, down to the frayed ribbon on her ear. Next to the statue, a plaque read, "In memory of Lillian McCrae, who waited in hope. May all lost voices one day be heard." At the opening ceremony, Eleanor sat on the real bench, hands folded in her lap, and looked out at the crowd. There were old men in uniform, teenagers with poppies on their shirts, mothers holding babies. One of the children, little girl with curly red hair and wide eyes, approached Eleanor with a flower in hand. "Was she your daughter?" the girl asked softly. Eleanor smiled, tears brimming. Yes, and now, she belongs to all of us. The girl placed the flower at the base of the statue and skipped back to her parents. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the park, Eleanor whispered a quiet goodbye to Lillian. It was not a goodbye of grief, but of peace. She had waited for decades to hear from her daughter. That message, scribbled with innocence and bravery, had reached her across time. And now, through this garden, Lillian's voice would echo forever. Children would laugh here, birds would nest in the cherry tree, and every year, on the anniversary of the bombing, people would gather not to mourn a tragedy, but to celebrate resilience, memory, and the small miracles that rise from the ashes. If this story moved you, please take a moment to leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your feelings, or memories of your own. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more true stories that honor forgotten voices and hidden histories.